Um, Welcome everybody to another installment of Monix Network Voices. Today we have a special guest joining us from the United Nations, Mita Sen. Mita, welcome. Tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do at the United Nations.
Thank you so much for inviting me and having me here with you today. As you said, I'm with the United Nations. Specifically, I work at the United Nations Forum on Forest Secretariat, which is located within the Department of Economic and Social Affairs. So yes, we're in a very large bureaucracy and hierarchy, but basically our office deals with forest issues and even trees outside of forests. So it's all things trees and all things forest. I've been with the UN for about 19 years now, I guess. Prior to that, I worked on environmental issues from a nonprofit perspective. But also focused on the UN. So my entire sort of professional life has always been in and around the UN, based here in New York. But the majority of my time at the UN, about the last 14 years or so, has been on forest.
That's great, and it really provides a kind of, we've been trying to understand what we call different ecologies, both economic and construction-wise in places like the US and Sweden. But I mean, you're getting a terrestrial perspective would be really great for these kind of discussions on offsite construction, but also on sustainable building and its relationship to forestry management. So we'd love to know more about what the UN is up to and what the Forum on Forest is up to. So if you have some slides you'd like to share with us, we'd love to see them.
Absolutely. So before I share the slides, I just wanted to mention that basically in terms of what we do at the UN and what kind of our general area of work is. So the UN, as you know, ultimately is all about facilitating dialogue and discussion. That's really what we do. So our work focuses on producing background information for meetings. Ultimately, it's the countries and governments that make the decisions. So we're kind of here to facilitate that. And in terms of UN processes, what we're always looking to do is kind of reach a point of agreement and find that common ground. So a lot of the work that we do is all about kind of the discussion and then somehow coming to that point of agreement. So for us, a landmark decision was in 2017. So to take a step back, in 2015, there were the Sustainable Development Goals that were very global. And forests are part of that. Cities are part of that. Habitat is part of that. All of these things that relate to your area of work. But the forest community decided that they really wanted to kind of showcase the role of forests within the Sustainable Development Goals. So in a way, as an answer to the 2030 Agenda and Sustainable Development Goals, the forest community came up with its own UN Strategic Plan for Forests 2030. So if you will allow me, I'd like to just walk you through a little bit of what's involved in that.
That would be fantastic.
Because this is basically what underpins our work.
That's great.
This is kind of our mandate and our focus. So
excellent.
Give me a second. So yeah, as I mentioned, it's the UN Strategic Plan for Forests 2030, and basically, run the show. So I just wanted to start by also just explaining or describing the intergovernmental body that I work for, which is the UN Forum on Forest. So the UN Forum on Forest was established about 20 years ago in 2000, and it's had several landmarks since its establishment. In 2007, the forum developed the first globally adopted UN forest instrument, which was adopted by the UN General Assembly, which is our highest body. In 2015, we started an area about mobilizing funding for forests. So we established the Global Forest Financing Facilitation Network. I know, very wordy, but basically all about raising financing for forests. And in 2017, the forum agreed on this UN Strategic Plan for Forests. The plan basically is meant to kind of, as I mentioned earlier, highlight how forests play a role in all aspects of sustainable development. So it touches upon all those issues that are addressed in the 2030 Agenda. And it features 6 goals. The first goal, this looks very long, but basically is all about reversing the loss of forest cover through sustainable forest management, through restoration, afforestation, you name it. But ultimately, the goal is we want more forests. And one of the targets within this goal is to increase the forest area by 3% worldwide by 2030. So thus far, the discussion has always been about stopping deforestation, halting deforestation. What the forest community is actually saying here is not only can we slow down deforestation, we can actually grow forests, increase the overall forest cover. The second goal is all about economic, social, and environmental benefits and enhancing these. And I think this is also highly relevant to your area of work because certainly, in terms of the construction industry and homes and all of that, it's ultimately about promoting how forests can benefit people and how forests can benefit people economically, socially, environmentally, looking at all of those aspects. An interesting target within this goal is actually to eradicate extreme poverty. And this is also something I think would be relevant to you because if you're looking at how you have sustainable supply chains and using forest products, you're ultimately helping local economies. You're helping people get jobs. You're helping all of these services. And so just to kind of tie it into how this is helping at the global level, this is one of those goals and targets that is, I felt is relevant to your network. The third goal is all about basically increasing protected areas as well. So that's, as we discussed previously, it's not just about only production or only protection, but it's about all of that, having some increasing the area of protected forests, also increasing the area of sustainably managed forests, and one of the goals of sustainable management is protection and conservation as well as increasing forest products from sustainably managed forests. So as a consumer, you have a choice. And if you have a choice between a product that comes from a sustainably managed forest versus not, this is where people can make an informed decision and use their buying power to ultimately make change. The goal through targets actually, as I already mentioned, talks about increasing the area of forests that are there for conservation and protection, basically as a component of what is ultimately important for sustainable forest management. Goal 4 is all about financing, because if you talk about what are the key challenges when it comes to managing forests, oftentimes one of the key barriers is not enough financing or not enough resources for forests. So this is something that governments felt was very important to highlight, that one of the building blocks that you need in order to support sustainable forest management is financing. Another important part, of course, is governance. And in this case, how this plays out is normally when you have policies that are adopted at the global level, there is the trickle down to the national level as well. So that very often you will have policy changes and policy development that takes place that synchronizes with this global level policy. And last but not least, all of this cannot be done without partnerships. So Goal 6 basically deals with talking about coordination between partners, whether they're within the UN, whether they're within other sectors and across stakeholders. So basically all of those goals, those 5 goals, won't happen unless everyone comes together. And that's one that I felt was also important to showcase to your network, is that ultimately it's all about kind of knowing who to work with. That's how
about building networks. Yeah,
exactly. Exactly. So that's it from my side in terms of a quick snapshot of the UN Strategic Plan of Forests and the Global Forest Goals. These ultimately underpin our work. This is in terms of the work that I do at the UN Forum on Forests. All of our work is about helping to promote greater awareness of these goals and targets. The way it works at the UN, when you have these kinds of agreements and goals, it's aspirational, right? These are voluntary. There isn't, a kind of a legal
obligation
under these. Yeah. And so what we also have is we've now started. So as I mentioned, this was adopted in 2017. So now 2.5 years in, we have increasingly countries that are making their voluntary commitments. So they have the flexibility to be like, oh, I have something I can contribute under that goal. here's my pledge. And that's kind of how the UN also works when it comes to, a wide range of goals and commitments, is that ultimately the action that happens on the ground is up to countries, is up to the local level actors. But this is meant to sort of provide this broader umbrella, and then, we take it from there. So in a snapshot, that's kind of, that's the main focus of our work currently at the UN Former Forest. And this is basically provides us with something, mandate until 2030.
Great. Yeah, and Mita, I just wanted to, so Mita, I had an opportunity to meet over a webinar discussing Sweden, which is a small country and a wealthy country with some good resources, but again, is one that, I think our interests overlapped simply because it's a kind of leader in forestry management and a leader in offsite construction. And one of the fascinating things, and it's just from a conceptual level, is that Sweden is a good example of the fact that increasing the use of wood-based products, in that case, construction products, and increasing forestation is not something that's contradictory. In fact, it seems to coincide. So while Sweden has always been, well, hasn't always been, it actually has got oscillated, as many countries have in the 20th century, in terms of just cut forestry and cover of forest throughout the country. Since they've increased their need for wood-based products, they've also increased forestation, and they've also increased the amount of revenue that can be invested in sustainable forestry practice. But that's something that, at least from as researchers in the sort of construction side of the space, that's not a concept that's widely understood. I think there's a lot of cultural barriers. And I think that's something that I think the UN is also quite interested in identifying and addressing from a communication and consensus building point of view. So maybe if you can say a little bit about how you see, those relationships, because as you said, UN it's focused on human beings, so ecologies, different kinds of ecologies, the sustainabilities that are social, ecological, economical. How do you see those relationships, and how do you see them moving forward in the near future?
Yeah, so what you touched upon is actually quite a challenge for us in terms of, especially related to communication. So a large part of my work within our office is actually focusing on both internal and external communication. And especially when it comes to forests, there is a tendency to sort of view forests through this very narrow biodiversity protection conservation viewpoint. And so part of what we're always trying to do is broaden that perspective and say, no, forests are actually a part of all of these different aspects of our daily lives.
Right.
Even if you live in a city, you may not be in a forest, but trust me, there are forest products that you're using and there are forest products that you're depending upon. And it's not just, the visible ones, but all of these other services that are being provided. So it is a challenge for us to kind of communicate also the fact that you can sustainably harvest and sustainably use forest resources, that it's not just about, put a fence around it and keep it safe kind of thing.
And protect it until someone
exactly.
Yeah.
And also, I mean, depending on which part of the world you're in, forests have actually been actively managed. I mean, when you look at European countries, there's that notion of sort of pristine forests is actually doesn't really apply. Yes, it does apply in certain parts of the world which have these huge tracts of forests that are very remote and inaccessible and so on and so forth. But depending on which part of the world you're in, it's forests have had human effects, and humans have been part of that ecosystem. So there's also this notion of forests as the other and people as the other sort of separation. And our the delegates that come to the Forum on Forests are primarily government delegates, and as you know, the majority of forests in the world are public. They're publicly owned, publicly managed. Yes, they're yet a lot of the production side is private, but ultimately the entities that are responsible for the world's forests are governments. And so they see this as a resource. And for governments, ultimately, they're serving people. They're looking at how can we best, what is the best we can provide for our people. And so
we would hope.
Exactly. So one of the biggest challenges, and this is one thing that I'm always sort of trying to communicate, is like, the biggest threat to forests is not logging or not using using forest products. The biggest threat to forests is actually agriculture. And again,
Right.
not agriculture as this big sort of evil, but it's the land that is valuable.
Right.
And
Well, it
sometimes
has
when
to do with and it has to do with the devaluation of wood. It's either as a cheap source of heating or not, or nothing at all, as an obstacle to more productive land,
yeah, absolutely.
which is something that seems, and it's interesting because, so, this is something we discussed too on this previous call, but so the US, for example, is in a unique position, exceptional in the world, in that in the US, there is a lot of wood-based construction, and there's a fairly high acceptance, which is not typical. People in many countries, developing, first world, second world, third world, do not trust wood as a building material. In the US, it is trusted, but our forestry practices treat, I mean, it's interesting, both sides of the spectrum, those that fear logging and those that advocate logging, both see forest the same way, as a kind of as a natural condition, not as something that's to be maintained. And that's something, it's interesting because agriculture as a form of food production in places like the Amazon rainforest, which is something that people need to survive, is one thing. We don't in the US, for example, and in parts of Europe and other countries that have those resources, forestry is not treated enough like agriculture, in the sense that it's understood as a man-managed economic activity, as well as something that can sequester CO2, that can increase biodiversity. And that seems like, again, a big obstacle. I mean, I know that, I'm sure you're familiar with this, but France has now made a big commitment to wood-based construction, outside of, again, a few countries in Northern Europe, even in European countries that have had a history of forestation practices. There's still cultural barriers to those wood-based products, particularly in construction. So it seems like, just wonder, as if without breaking some of those barriers, we could start seeing either, again, a rejection of what could be a really sustainable but also economically beneficial product on the one hand, or really the exploitation of virgin forest, which is not really, and deforestation, negative deforestation, without really understanding those concepts. It seems like you guys have there's a lot to do, and that story hasn't quite been told, at least clearly enough, so that, and I think building those networks, as you said, I think it seems like a really key moment to achieving those sustainability goals, as well as the social goals that we all hopefully share.
Yeah, and I think, part of the challenge that we face also from within the forest community is very often we are speaking to like-minded people.
Right.
So you end up kind of speaking to the converted, so to say. And how do you get these messages across to those other sectors that are making those decisions? So very often, even within governments, you have silos, just like within organizations, you have silos. So what is glaringly obvious to some of us is not necessarily as obvious to others when they're making that decision. So a lot of times, also things like coming together with these global goals that are in a way endorsed by the UN provides actually a communication platform a lot of times for organizations to say, hey, look, we have these global goals, and what we're doing is actually contributing to
aligned
them. And so it's a way of also kind of informing decision making, trying to guide that process, because exactly as you said, I mean, foresters know what forests can do. Forest industry knows what forests can do. I mean, within
conservationists know, and but there's a whole other group of constituencies that maybe don't understand their relationship to it.
Right, and then what tends to, unfortunately, is the negative news. So, that's what gets sensationalized, and so you have everything from forest fires to you name it, that tends to rise up very quickly to a headline level. Whereas kind of but look, there's good work being done over here at the local level or by industry in terms of providing services to a community, and here's how. I am not as familiar personally industry side of things, I must admit. But there are parts of the UN that work specifically on sort of the construction aspects and the housing aspects. And it is fascinating because ultimately what we're talking about is how do you live a sustainable life, right? Ultimately, the goal is to have to have change that translates and almost becomes second thought, second nature, that it should be, that's how you see sustainable change happening over time. And in that sense, the homes that we live in, especially now during COVID days, I mean, our homes have become even more important to us. And of course, our workplaces as well. So just the whole notion of, what is as humans, what is our environment? It's the built environment, for the most part, except with the exception of those who get there. And so if we're able to incorporate those sustainable choices into this very basic need that we all have for shelter, I think that is ultimately
habitat, to use a UN term.
Exactly. Human and biodiversity habitat. So yeah, I do think that that's the challenge. I don't know if we've necessarily been able to address it but that's certainly what our goal as well.
Yeah. No, and again, but the fascination with Sweden was that their goals were not about forestry protection. They were really about job creation. They were about increasing manufacturing jobs. It was also about and then lowering the cost of housing. And so it's interesting that again, and that it's an interesting example of focusing on understanding what many other constituencies need, and in a way finding a network around which good forestry management that is both economically, socially, and ecologically sustainable seems to come through. So it's interesting, and I'm happy to see that the UN is taking a leadership role, because I think it's fortunately still one of the greatest agents for good in the world, and hopefully that will hopefully get even. As politics change, hopefully we'll get even more listened to. But yeah, no, I think we really, at least from our perspective as researchers too in this space, we're trying to find ways to really kind of break those silos. And it sounds like you guys are doing the same thing, and breaking cultural barriers around forestry, and also about wood-based products seems like something we all need to do more work on. But would certainly benefit the planet. So Mita, thanks for joining us today. This is really great to get a intro into what your world is like. And I think hopefully this may be the beginning of a dialogue. Maybe we can get you involved in some webinars or discussions in the future. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.